Sabelo, why do you think there's a need for structural, epistemic, and personal decolonization?
Throughout history, the colonial system has always been reforming itself. And it then gives you an illusion that it has changed. You are invited into the system did not change. It continues. Reform, in simple terms, is a tactic of self-preservation of a system. It is not change of a system. Go to Harare, they will be teaching sociology the same people. Go to Pretoria, they will be teaching the same people. Go to Tel Aviv, they will be teaching the same people. Africans for millennia prior to colonialism, they were able to do things using their own knowledge systems. But colonialism, when it came, it delegitimated those knowledge systems, introduced its own knowledge system. And it is that knowledge system which today is in the minds of the modern subjects. We breathe it, as Nelson Maldonado Torres will say, that we breathe the coloniality as modern subjects. Decolonizing, therefore, means that we change the archive from which we draw what we know. And that also means that we recover that which has been displaced. We need to remember what was dismembered. RE-member, picking the pieces and rejoining together what was separated. Therefore, we need to look for other knowledges so that we rescue ourselves from the systemic and the epistemic crisis we find ourselves in. And it is within this context that you therefore draw from Islamic knowledge, you draw from African knowledge, you draw from Indian knowledge, you draw from indigenous people's knowledge. One knowledge system from one civilization is no longer adequate. It is no longer adequate to the problems the world is facing.
Sabelo, my first question to you is that could you please tell us what you think decolonization is?
There is no way you can talk about decolonization without talking about colonization in the first instance. So it means I need to start to speak about maybe two concepts, the concept of colonization and the concept of colonialism, which are always used interchangeably. But for analytical purposes, I think it would be important for us to separate the two concepts. That colonization can be an event, but colonialism is a process. And it is a process in which the colonizers wanted to claim almost the whole of the earth as theirs, and then reduce others, maybe as providers of labor, as well as also impose their own knowledge systems, their cultures, their languages. And because of that, they also dispossessed those people whom they found, displaced some of them, subjected some of them to what we call genocide. And also those who survived, most of them, they then were subjected to the capitalist system, whereby after being dispossessed, they then become, they have nothing they remain with except their labor, which they then sell in the market in support of the system of capitalist colonialism. And it is these inimical processes which then provoked, first of all, those who were enslaved to revolt against the system of enslavement. And we trace the whole question of decolonization as far back maybe to the Haitian Revolution of 1791 to 1804 as the earliest form of organized resistance against the capitalist system, the colonial system, and the racist system. And that also moved on from the African diaspora to the continent itself, where the resistance to colonialism took various forms, including armed struggles, as well as industrial riots, labor riots, peasant resistances, women organizing resistances against various aspects of colonialism, particularly its dehumanizing aspects, its exploitative aspect. That's what really made people realize that the rhetoric of civilizing the colonized was a lie in the true sense of the word. The reality was really to dehumanize, to exploit, and to take resources from the colonized. So there is a way you can define decolonization first as resistance against colonialism or colonization as an event. And that generally took the form of political decolonization. But we've realized that since the attainment of political independence, colonialism as a system does not go away. It remains. So there is a shift from empire to modern nation states. But in that shift, we cannot quickly celebrate as the end of colonialism as a system. It might be the end of colonization as an event. But the system, because when we talk about a system, we're talking about something which is ingrained in institutions, in structures, in psyches of the people. So that one, it will take time to really fight against, because it becomes invisible. And perhaps when Kwame Nkrumah in 1965 was talking about neo-colonialism, he was actually talking about the continuation of colonial-like relations even after the withdrawal of the physical empire. So I think we will need to be really precise in when we're talking about decolonization in 20th century. We're talking more specifically about political aspect of it. Today, the concept has expanded. It has expanded into epistemological decolonization, which is actually targeting the decolonization of knowledge. It has expanded to economic decolonization, which is really about who owns the resources in the formerly colonized spaces and how do we restore land, for instance, which was taken from the colonized people. So it's a concept which has assumed what I will call an omnibus character, so much so that people have put so many things into it, to the extent that you can speak about cultural decolonization, decolonization of asiatics, decolonization of the mind, decolonization of the curriculum, decolonization of pedagogies, the way we teach, and the decolonization of even the conceptions of being human itself.
How does one make a distinction between anti-colonial, decolonial, and post-colonial?
I think there are three concepts there which needs unpacking and defining for for purposes of clarity and the understanding of what decolonization is. When we talk about anti-colonial, we are talking really about the struggles, the physical struggles, which were prosecuted against an observable physical empire. That was anti-colonial. And the limits of anti-colonial is that the withdrawal of the physical empire is taken as the end of colonialism. And more often than not, the problem is that those who take over, they generally do not change the institutions, the structures, and all what is inherited from colonialism, they carry over from where they left. So that's where anti-colonial is not decolonial. Decolonial then comes in as a more radical part, which actually targets the structural, the systemic, and the institutional, and it targets them for change. That really you change the institutions which were introduced by colonialism, you change the structures which were introduced by colonialism, you change even the intersubjective relations which were introduced by colonialism, rather than to turn them upside down. That the colonizer was up, and now the African becomes up. If you do that, we have not destructured, we have just turned the scale upside down. So that's the limits of anti-colonial. But they are related, as you can tell. Anti-colonial was supposed to, if it is genuine, it was supposed to culminate in decolonial. The post-colonial is something else. The post-colonial emerges particularly in the 1990s. It emerges at a time when the Marxist thinking was now delegitimized. The nationalist projects were no longer thought of as the right way to take us into the future. That's when you have the emergence of the post-colonial. And the foundational text in post-colonial thinking is the work of the Palestinian scholar Edward Said, and his book published in 1978, Orientalism. That is this text which is always referred to as inaugurating the post-colonial. And the post-colonial raised a number of debates. The first one is, does post-colonial means after colonialism? And I think the most sophisticated answer is that post-colonial does not mean after colonialism. It means the continuation of colonialism, reproduction of the colonial structures, logics within what Achille Mbembe will call the post-colony. So the post-colony, if you look at it carefully, it becomes continuity in discontinuities. When colonialism is said to have discontinued, post-colonialism see continuities in that.
How does one colonize being human itself?
To answer that question of how being human itself is colonized, I think it would be important for us to understand basically the key units of analysis in decolonial thinking and the decolonial work. There are three key units in the decolonial thinking, which will enable us to make it clear how being human itself is colonized. The first unit is of course being human. In order for colonialism to lay its foundations, in order for the colonizers' model of the world to be a reality, they engaged in a number of processes, some which are really discursive, and by discursive we mean those which work not with our physical presence, but with our imagination, with our thinking. And the first important point to highlight is that in order to colonize the world, one issue for certain was to organize or redefine the human in accordance with the imperatives of colonialism. And that meant physically social classification of human population. The social classification of human population meant that you classify them into white, yellow, black. You classify them into female, male. You classify them into women, men. Of course, if you are thinking not decolonial, you will think, oh, this is a necessary process, social ordering of the world. But in decolonial thinking, we understand that it was not merely a form of social ordering of the world. In fact, there was a hierarchization. You socially classify, then you racially hierarchize. Then you also gender the human relations in accordance with the hierarchy again. So you then end up with what I will call an invisible social pyramid, in which at the top are those who are defined as white. Then maybe intermediate, you will have those who are defined as red or brown. And then at the bottom, you have those who are defined as black. And then you have others who are not even included in this scheme of things, who are kicked out of the human family altogether. And this way of social classification of human population, racial hierarchizing it, and gendering, these three constitute the colonization of being itself. And the purpose of doing that was a very sinister one. In the first place, how do you identify who to enslave, who to colonize, who to confine to the domestic sphere? You will need to use that social pyramid to do that. Then you say those with full human density, if I can put it that way, full human density, those who claim to be the template of humanity. And then you have some who are subhuman, then you have some who are non-human. So the non-human, what you do to them, you treat them the way we treat animals and the trees. You can kill them. And those are the people in the Americas who were subjected to genocide. Then the people from Africa, they were not totally kicked out of the human family. They were pushed down the ladder, the social pyramid, into subhumanity. And because they are subhuman, then they are targets for enslavement. And then you will see what happened to the Chinese, what happens to the Indians, the coolie system. You also subject them to power in a different way because of using that social pyramid. This is why we talk about coloniality of being. But the coloniality of being does not work alone. It works also with the coloniality of knowledge. Because if you say some people are not human, some are subhuman, some are non-human, the non-human, they have no knowledge. Cows don't have knowledge. Donkeys don't have knowledge. Subhuman, you then say, yeah, they might have knowledge, but it is primitive knowledge. Knowledge which needs to die. It doesn't contribute to society at all. So you delegitimate, you disqualify the knowledge. And then you maintain the knowledge of those on the top of the social hierarchy. So that's where the coloniality of being and the coloniality of knowledge link. But once we have created the pyramid, you will need to govern it. And the way you govern it, that's when the coloniality of power comes in. You will need then to develop institutions, systems, and the structures to govern that. So this is why we have these three: coloniality of being, coloniality of knowledge, and the coloniality of power. And they, in totality, if they are taken together, they constitute what we call colonial matrices of power. And they run the world up to today.
Wow. Thank you so much. Can you talk about the overuse of the term decolonization? What are the dangers of using this concept as a metaphor and a buzzword? Because currently everyone is decolonizing something, whether it's food, hair. So can you speak to that?
In fact, I think this is an opportunity also to say that in the first instance, the concept of decolonization is a revolutionary concept. It's not just a lip service concept. Secondly, the concept of decolonization emerges from struggles. It does not emerge from the academy. The concept of decolonization is really a subversive concept, if I can put it that way. It is meant to subvert the structures, the institutions, and it is meant to really also change the consciousness of the modern subjects, if I can put it that way. And it is meant also to enable rewelding, if I can use that word, rewelding from the perspective of those who have been enslaved, those who have been colonized, those who have been racialized. So what it fundamentally means in revolutionary terms is that there is a colonizer's model of the world. Then there is a decolonial vision of the world. And the decolonial vision of the world is that what has been the gift of the colonizer's model of the world, it excludes other people from power. It excludes other people from the economy. It excludes other people from so many other sectors of life, and even from life itself. You have heard about this concept of premature death. People who die not because their time for death has come. They die because of the conditions and the circumstances in which they find themselves. So it's a concept which cannot just mean everything and nothing at the end of the day. But at the moment, you know that the survival of coloniality is to appropriate concepts which emerge against it, and it disciplines them so that they become part and parcel of what we call the status quo. So the widespread use of decolonization to mean so many things and nothing at the end of the day is very dangerous, if I can put it that way. It's very dangerous in the sense that for a concept to really mean change, to perform what it was meant to, it must be precise. And the very fact that now nobody fears the concept, it means it has been appropriated, and it can actually be part and parcel of the status quo. And once it works like that, of course, people can talk about it meaning different things altogether. But I must actually make it clear that if you are in Europe, decolonization means something else to you. If you are in Africa, it means something else to you, because it must be contextual. For instance, if we are talking about decolonizing the University of Bayreuth, it is very different from decolonizing the University of South Africa, in the sense that in Bayreuth, we are talking more about social inclusion, diversity, and what we call equality. In other words, it's a demographic question. Whereas if we're in Cape Town or in South Africa, you will be talking really about maybe iconography, the symbols which are at the center of the university, like the statue of Cecil John Rhodes at Cape Town. If you were at UNISA, University of South Africa, you will find that there were very contextual, practical issues which needed to be changed. Particularly, the first thing which we dealt with was the question of casualization of black labor. And that was what we spoke about in terms of insourcing, of outsourced workers. Then if you moved to the University of Witwatersrand, their issue was the registration fees, the access to higher education. That's where the fees must fall movement emerged in that context. So this idea that nowadays everything is now become decolonize this, it really makes it, it demeans a revolutionary concept which is meant to deal with very specific issues. And I think there are dangers there. But the caveat which I need to put is that perhaps even some of us who have been pushing this idea of decolonization, we're trying to mobilize the world behind the concept of decolonization. And the world has responded. But the world, when it responds, don't say everyone now has become a decolonial revolutionary. Some are actually taking advantage of the concept to do reformist work, not revolutionary work. So there is a difference between reform of a system and change of a system. Throughout history, the colonial system has always been reforming itself. Whenever it faces anti-systemic forces, it always either it disciplines them physically, totally kills, or it opens space for them within the same system. And it then gives you an illusion that it has changed. We saw it after 1945, when people fought against colonialism physically, carried guns in armed liberation struggles. What was the sign of being independent? Being invited into the United Nations system, into the lowest echelons of the United Nations system where we have no veto power. You are invited into the system. The system did not change. It continues. So reform, in simple terms, is a tactic of self-preservation of a system. It is not change of a system. So most of the noises which are happening today under the banner of decolonization are reformist. They are not revolutionary. So it's a matter of whereby you will go to universities, even in South Africa, where roads must fall and fees must fall. People will be giving you statistics. We've changed 5 modules. We've included Sabelo and Lovu's work, and therefore we've decolonized. That is reform. That is not revolutionary change. Because the revolutionary change means that there is an institutional transformation in such a way that a university become a home for everyone. Women must feel comfortable within a university. It must not continue to be patriarchal and dominated by men. People from peasant background, from working class background, they must find themselves comfortable within university. It must not be an institution whereby you need to enter through the gate and then you die and you are reborn in order to be a university student. You change your dressing, you change your food preferences, you change your accent. If you do that, that's not change at all.
Thank you so much. That was very profound. As a decolonial scholar, why do you think decolonization is necessary?
The necessity of decolonization is detected by the continuation of colonialism. And in the 21st century, we don't talk about colonialism in the historical sense we're talking about in the 20th century. This is why, from the Latin American school, we have actually borrowed this concept of coloniality. Coloniality actually explains that by the time we were celebrating what is called political independence, it fundamentally meant that colonialism mutated into a global power structure, transnational global power structure. It did not come to an end. And if you read the work of scholars such as Walter Mignolo, Ramon Grossfogel, and Nelson Matonato Torres, and many others, they will tell you that colonialism is not over, is all over. In other words, when we fought it, as maybe in South Africa, in Ghana, in Zimbabwe, it pretended to have died, but it mutated to be an invisible system which is global. And this is the context in which you will find people now speaking again under the banner of decolonization. And nobody forces people to speak about it that way. The people, they find decolonization to be a legitimate and a useful grammar of liberation, if I can put it that way. But you must understand also that in different geopolitical spaces, geospatial spaces, you will find that people use different grammars. If you go to Canada, for instance, you go to New Zealand, you go to Australia, you will find so many people fighting under the banner of indigenization. If you go to Africa, you will find some people prefer the concept Africanization. If you come to Europe and other places, you find people fighting under the banner of social inclusion. And to me, I don't want to exhaust my energy in trying to say which grammar is correct, which one is not correct. What I always want to check is, under this grammar, what structural changes are you doing? What personal changes are you doing? What intersubjective changes are you doing? So it looks like at the moment we are entering into what William E.P. Du Bois termed the second side. You know, there was a first side of colonialism when it was physical. Now there's a second side of colonialism when it is now metaphysical, when it is now cognitive. People are saying, but we can still see you. You have not gone, you are still here. Hence, we need to intensify the struggles for decolonization. And you saw it that also, even when the physical empire was pushed back, it is not true that its symbols, its signatures, its iconography, its monuments were all removed. This is why you saw the demonumentalization movement, which grabbed the whole world after the death of George Floyd in the US. Then a lot of people in Europe, everywhere, they were going for statues of those people who were involved in enslavement, those who were involved in colonialism, those who were racist, like Cecil John Rhodes, and they were destroying them. Not in the 20th century today, because they were still symbols of colonialism all over the world.
Sabelo, why do you think there's a need for structural, epistemic, and personal decolonization?
I think what we need to take into account is that colonialism is a planetary force of domination. That's one. Two, we need to also take into account that it affects all aspects of human life. Structures, knowledges, and the interpersonal relations. And therefore, if you want to do decolonization, you need to target it in its pockets, the structures, the knowledges, the institutions of higher education, the interpersonal relations. In simple terms, colonialism hides in the structures. Structurally, it means that the world remains hierarchical. Structurally, at the top echelons of the structure, the invisible structure, obviously is the United States of America, with its Pentagon, with now the NATO and all. They are up there. They are the ones which oversee this world. There's one they discipline if you try to do change here and there. So structurally, we are still hierarchical. Hierarchical in a political sense and a very visible political sense. That the very fact that we have something called a superpower is a sign of a structured system of power. And that structure of power is colonial by its very nature, because those who are on the top, on the apex of it, they detect what must be done below. So it's as simple as that structurally. But structurally also, that structure reproduces itself even within countries. Even countries in the global south. The elites up there, the workers below, the peasants and the women below. It's a hierarchical structure. And if the structure remains like that, colonialism did not go. Because what was meant was that everyone needed to be reborn as citizens, equally consenting citizens. But if we maintain the structures, it means others. That's why we have first families. I don't know whether we have fourth or fifth other families. So structurally there is that. But structurally also, you have also problems of institutions. Institutions like universities, which are actually a cog in the world system, reproducing those structures. And hence, structurally, we are saying they need to undergo institutional change. So they need also to change institutional change so that they don't become places for elites. And secondly, they don't become those spaces whereby if you have no money, you cannot even come near. They are supposed to actually conceive knowledge as a public good, not as a commodity which is sold to those with money. So the structural issues, I think, they are as clear as possible. The structures are racial, the structures are patriarchal, the structures are economic, and they are still standing. Why do you think that in the whole world, the bulk of the working people who clean the toilets, who clean the streets, are people of a particular race? It was not made by God. It's a structural issue. Because they were dispossessed under colonialism, they were enslaved. They lost everything, so they are selling their labor to the racial capitalist system. And when we are saying racial capitalist system, we are trying also to make it clear that people understand that if you use the word capitalist only, it doesn't really capture the essence of the reality. The reality is that there are particular people of a particular racial orientation who own the means of production. Then there are people of a particular racial orientation who are providing labor across the world. That is at the structural level.
And what about epistemic decolonization?
The simplest answer to that also is that knowledge is not innocent. Knowledge is political. And as political as it is, there is knowledge for liberation, there is knowledge for oppression. Okay. So what we reproduce and perhaps we teach, we might actually be teaching knowledge is for domination. And if I can put it this way, when I was talking about that if you create a social pyramid, you need to govern it. Yeah. What I did not elaborate is that all aspects of human life are subjected to coloniality of power. All aspects, including concepts of beauty and ugly, is subjected to that structure of power. Spiritualities are subjected to that structure of power in the sense that perhaps the written religions, Christianity and Islam, they are the ones who are on the top. All others are delegitimated. Other forms of spirituality are delegitimated. If you go to language, you will find, again, written languages, colonial languages, we are using it even now. Other languages are not even in the academy. They are actually in the margins of the academy. You can go list by list. There is nothing about modern life which is not subjected to coloniality of power in a hierarchical manner. The same thing with knowledge. If we have no alphabet, therefore we have no knowledge. It's as simple as that. If your knowledge is oral, it is inferior to written knowledge. If yourself, you are said to be subhuman, it fundamentally means you have no epistemic virtue. In other words, whatever you say doesn't carry value. This is why you will find maybe scholars like Chakrabarti Spivak speaking about the question, can the subaltern speak? It doesn't mean that they have no voice. They have no voice, but who listens to them? Nobody. Because of this structure, even voices are hierarchized. So the epistemic fundamentally means that the knowledge which is considered to be objective, scientific, is the one which is privileged. All other forms of knowing are pushed to the margins, displaced, or even denied that they are knowledges.
Why do you think personal decolonization is necessary?
Personal decolonization is necessary because colonialism affects interpersonal relations. The major issue is that colonialism works through divide and rule. Secondly, colonialism also works through hierarchizing people's relations. And in terms of decolonization, we want, therefore, to destructure that so that we bring back the issue of interdependence of human beings. And also make sure that the relations between human beings is underpinned by ethics, is underpinned by what in the Southern African regions calls Ubuntu. We see ourselves in other people. We don't actually see other people as a resource to exploit. So that's why it is important to when you think about decolonizing, you need specifically to say, in which sector should I intervene? The structural sector, you intervene. The epistemic sector, you intervene. The personal sector, you intervene. And the personal is where there is a lot of work to be done. Because colonialism enters even our psyches, the way we think. It also affects our, what we call our consciousness. And it is important that we intervene in that space by starting by decolonizing myself before I talk about decolonizing other things. Then when it comes to interpersonal relations, I think that one is almost self-explanatory. As long as there are some people who are privileged in terms of their race, their gender, there are some who are underprivileged. This is the same thing whereby it even translates into the space of gender struggles. That if you go by Fanoni's analysis, he will say the world then became divided into zone of being and a zone of non-being. Those who have full humanity, they occupy the zone of being. And in the zone of being, it means ethics, law, good governance, human rights, democracy determine your life. In the zone of non-being, expropriation, violence, and all what is subjected not to human beings is subjected to people. The same thing, even if you are women in the zone of non-being and the women in the zone of being. Of course, you can all cry about patriarchy, but patriarchy subjects you differently across the zones. So that's where we are.
We now turn to epistemic freedom. What is epistemology?
In its simplest and a very straightforward way, epistemology is a way of knowing.
And what is epistemic freedom?
Epistemic freedom is actually the right to think as yourself. Mm-hmm. And this cannot arise unless there was an attempt to make you think as something else. Mm-hmm. So the question of epistemic freedom arises within a very specific historical moment and the reality. The reality of an imposed knowledge on a people, to the extent that that imposed knowledge makes them think not as themselves, but to mimic, what we call to copy, the way those who bring this other foreign knowledge, they then try to think like that. So it is a question which arises within what we call alienation, being separated from yourselves, from your history, from your culture, from your language. So it is really a restorative decolonial concept, which says, go back to be yourself, think as yourself, think from where you are.
What do you think is the state of decolonization in Africa? Where are we now? And how do you think we should move forward?
It's very hard to generalize about Africa, but I can draw some common issues about the state of decolonization in Africa. The whole of Africa now, I think, it has attained what we call political independence, but you must always put it in quotation marks. Political independence. The problem arises in the sense that that political independence has not translated into economic independence. The Africans still find themselves rich in natural resources which are not processed within the continent in the first instance. Secondly, natural resources which they don't own. It's next to you, but is not yours. Gold, we have gold in Africa, we have diamonds in Africa, we have almost all minerals. But it is not this simplistic idea that Africa is rich only because the resources are in Africa, but who owns them? I think is a fundamental question. The deepest mine in South Africa, Wenela, is owned by DPR's Rothschild, the multinational companies. The workers were killed in Lomnin, in Rustenburg. Lomnin is a multinational company. It owns the company there. The black people of South Africa provide the labor. And even when they are crying for a living wage, the state and the capital, they collude. So it's that state whereby the political independence has not yet translated materially into economic empowerment of the African people. The third dimension is that political independence was also supposed to be accompanied by epistemic freedom. Africans thinking for themselves, Africans being craftswomen and craftsmen, and that means people who are able to do things for themselves. But since independence, we've been asking for aid from the global north as though we are a deficient human beings who cannot do things for themselves. And that actually is linked to the way colonialism reproduced us as dependent people. And I can actually go down to the historical facts. That, for instance, when colonialism arrived in West Africa, it found West Africans, they were able to produce food for themselves. And the colonialists said, no, we need to restructure the economies. We need to restructure the economies in such a way that you produce cash crops rather than food crops. You produce cash crops, sell to us. We pay you in money, then you buy food. And that's how peasant trade colonies emerged in West Africa. In Central Africa, plantation economies. The typical notorious one being King Leopold II's Congo Free State, where people were forced to do nothing else but to produce rubber, which was needed for the industrialization of Belgium. And if you did not bring the right quota, he was cutting even hands. You go to Southern Africa is a different ball altogether. In Southern Africa, the intention was to permanently settle by the colonialists. And what are the implications? You can't settle where there are other people, isn't it?
True.
So they needed to remove the other people, dispossess them, take the land, turn them into workers, and then we have secular colonialism. So the state of the continent is that we need to intensify decolonization beyond the attainment of political independence. Political independence meant the sovereignty of the state, not the sovereignty of the people. And a lot of people are realizing now that the sovereignty of the state is not the sovereignty of the people. This is why throughout the continent, the celebrations of Independence Day, it is the elites inviting the peasants and the workers to come and celebrate with them. Workers who own nothing, who are unemployed, the peasants who own nothing, they're invited, but you must celebrate independence. But whose independence is this? It is the independence of the elites who are in charge of the state. And it is only with the Arab Spring, what they called the Arab Spring, beginning in 2011 in Tunisia, that people were beginning to say, no, we need to recapture the sovereignty of the people and they challenge these elites. But unfortunately, the military always intervene to compromise those revolutions. You can see it in Egypt, what happened. You can see it in Sudan, what happened. You can see it in almost all these African countries where the military rule is returning. People are fighting an authoritarian regime. in order to recapture their sovereignty, the military intervenes as though is in your side, but to reinstate the same structures of power which deny you the sovereignty. So at the moment, there is a second side, as I said before, a second side whereby you are now looking at the condition of Africa and they say, what exactly is the problem? And they were beginning to say perhaps the main problem is actually in the knowledge sector. The knowledges which we produce in Africa are irrelevant in most of the times. And then we are trying to say by decolonizing, we are not saying throw away everything European, but we are saying we need a knowledge which actually works for Africa, which actually works for Africa to the extent that its resources actually must work for the Africans. That's one. Two, the educated people whom we produce, they must be able to do things in Africa. Why are we not able to make vaccines in Africa? But we produce medical doctors, we produce scientists, we produce all this. What type of scientists do we produce which can't produce anything? And we wait, like we are waiting for the rain. You wait for a vaccine to come from Europe. And fundamentally, it means we need to then revisit our school system, our university system, to make sure that we produce people who really are capable of making what we want within the continent. And to me, this is where really the decolonization of the 21st century has taken us, to epistemological decolonization, to begin to question the ways in which we know, how we know what we know, and for what purpose.
Can you speak to the following ecologies of knowledges, situated knowledges, and the African archive moving from a colonial archive?
I think to frame all that, it takes us back to the whole, what exactly is the problem of coloniality of knowledge? And I think the best answer maybe came from Steve Biko's widely quoted statement that the success of colonial system, the success of those who are powerful, is because they control the minds of the powerless. The pointed weapon in the hand of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. Remember that statement?
Yeah.
The most important weapon in the mind of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. And the question which arises, how does one end up controlling minds of other people? Other people say it's due to me impossible. I have my own mind, you have your own mind. How do I end up in control of your mind? And the question of coloniality of knowledge actually helps us to understand that it is very possible that you control the minds of other people. Not directly. You don't tell people, I'm here to control your minds. I'm here to provide education. And in that education, from preschool, primary school, secondary school to university, it programs the mind in the service of those who are dominant, those who are powerful. And at the end of the day, you end up thinking really in service of what oppresses you. So it has a number of dimensions. The archive is one. When we say the archive, we mean, what do you read? where do you draw what do you know? You said you are a sociologist. In sociology, there is something called a canon. And the canon consists of Max Weber, Karl Marx, Emil Durkheim, and they are all from the global north. But if you go to Harare, they will be teaching sociology the same people. Go to Pretoria, they will be teaching the same people. Go to Tel Aviv, they will be teaching the same people. And that is the archive, which then shapes your way of knowing. And the issue is, why should you take the archive from Germany and you are teaching it down there? The idea is that because there was nothing. There was nothing. So it was empty. Empty lands, empty knowledges. There were no knowledges. But the truth of the matter is that there is something called African archive. Africans for millennia prior to colonialism, they were able to do things using their own knowledge systems. But colonialism, when it came, it delegitimated those knowledge systems, introduced its own knowledge system. And it is that knowledge system which today is in the minds of the modern subjects, if I can put it that way. We breathe it, as Nelson Maldonado Torres will say, that we breathe the coloniality as modern subjects. Because for over 500 years, that's what they've been feeding us. Institutionally, systemic, and even interpersonally, that's what they've been. The issue of decolonizing, therefore, means that we change the archive from which we draw what we know. And that also means that we recover that which has been displaced and bring them into the center of the academy. And it is within that context that the concept of ecologies of knowledge arises. Because it doesn't mean then you remove the Eurocentric knowledge. It is problematic, but it is still useful. And I want that to be very clear. It is problematic, but it is still useful. It is no longer adequate to the problems the world is facing. And because it is no longer adequate to the problems the world is facing, therefore we need to look for other knowledges so that we rescue ourselves from the systemic and the epistemic crisis we find ourselves in. And it is within this context that you therefore draw from Islamic knowledge, you draw from African knowledge, you draw from Indian knowledge, you draw from indigenous people's knowledge in order to bring into the academy for the service of humanity, not for nationalist purposes. This is where the caveat needs to be put. It means that the problems of facing humanity are so sophisticated that one knowledge system from one civilization is no longer adequate.
In your work, Sabelo, and specifically recently in a chapter or a book chapter that we co-authored entitled Blackism on a World Scale, you use a phrase or concept of paradigm of difference. Could you please unpack that for us, and also how it relates perhaps to apartheid, and also perhaps what we see in the United States of America with the killings of innocent black people?
The paradigm of difference is it's a very important concept which we work with in the decolonial work. The paradigm of difference speaks about separations, how you find what is together, then you separate it. It is a logic which rejects co-presence, unities. It divides. It is a logic which fits into what, in simple terms, is called divide and rule, or define and rule. It is a long-standing problem which, if we go back to where it begins really with the definition of who is human and who is not, who has to live and who has to die, who has to own things and who has to work for the other. So it is this paradigm, and it is linked with another paradigm, which is the paradigm of discovery. So whenever you read about the two, you need to read them together, the paradigm of discovery and the paradigm of difference. Paradigm of difference fundamentally creates the colonizer-colonized difference, the white-black difference. The woman-man, not as innocent concepts, but as hierarchies. So it's a paradigm which, in decolonial thinking, we think we need to remember what was dismembered. It is a dismembering logic. And to dismember is something is membered like this, then you dismember, you separate. And when we speak about it from decolonial point of view, we then speak about it in terms of it dismembered. Decolonization needs to remember. Remember not in terms of memory. Remember, RE-member. Remember, picking the pieces and rejoining together what was separated. And then, if we understand it that way, it takes us directly to the apartheid ideology of separate development, which was institutionalized in 1948 in South Africa, whereby it said the black and the white are two different species. As two different species, they needed to pursue different agendas. And it then developed into the production of what was called the Bantustans, whereby it said even black people are not one people. Black people are tribes. As tribes, they are contending tribes. They are always fighting against each other. And in order to make them live in peace, you need to have Transkei, Ciskei, Kazangulu, KwaZulu-Natal, the Zulu, all the Bantustans. They were informed by the paradigm of difference. But there was a deeper politics in that. The deeper politics was that we don't want black people to coalesce into a nation. Because if they coalesce into a nation and they develop national consciousness, then they will fight against the colonialists. So you divide them, saying you are not even one people, you are separate people. And once you do that, you stop the wheels of the development of national consciousness, which feeds into nationalism, which then feed into the anti-colonial struggles. Then people begin to fight against the system. So it's a paradigm which when it comes to it is also a paradigm which feeds into problems of sexism. Sexism, whereby you just say, but the women are inferior, men are superior. So it's a logic which almost governs so much of these differentiations, the binaries, if you want to use that term, and the dualities. Black here, white there, male here, female there, a human, non-human. And you refuse that these things can live in an ecology. It even goes to the extent that you then say there is nature, then there are humans on the other side. And you then don't understand that humans are actually part of nature. Fundamentally, they are part of nature. It is only stupidity which can make us feel like we are above nature, nature is below us. And we only realize that we are part of it when the nature gets angry and it begins to consume us. in terms of floods, in terms of pandemics, in terms of this. That's when you realize, oh, I'm also part of nature. I thought I was superior, I was above it. Nature is a natural resource available for me to exploit ad infinitum, if I can use that word.
Sabelo, there are many scholars who have been committed to the decolonial project. Could you perhaps mention one that you perhaps have sort of, I'm sure it's not just one, but who comes into mind that have sort of also inspired you as a thinker?
In doing the work of decolonizing, particularly in the domain of knowledge, I personally been inspired by so many thinkers who, if they were alive today, they might not describe themselves as decolonial, but we recover them as decolonial. Of course, they exist across space and time, and also geography. You have the earliest literate in the Western sense, black thinkers who were maybe in Europe, like Anthony Willem Amo, who was here in Germany, who got a PhD in philosophy, and who wrote about the rights of black people in Europe, the right of Moors, that was the word by then. He tried by all means to challenge the thought, but he was a minority, he was not a majority. But you must know also that in Eurocentric thought, there is always autocritique within it. And there are some people who accept that objectivity is nonsense within Eurocentric thought itself. So it's not like a singular church with one doctrine. There is what Emmanuel Wallerstein terms anti-Eurocentric Eurocentrism. You know, anti-Eurocentric, it is a European thinker criticizing Eurocentrism, but still remaining Eurocentric, if I can put it that way. And that is very, very common, that people can question some of the tenets of Eurocentric thought without necessarily abandoning Eurocentrism. So I think Amo was within that context. I think he was beginning to me, withdraw from his interventions to advance the decolonial agenda, in the sense that he began to give a topic which other philosophers were not talking about in the first instance. Secondly, if you read his work, he was beginning to think differently from European philosophers, even if he was produced as part of the Enlightenment project. So you will find Amo was challenging even the way they defined what thinking was, what scholarship was all about, and he was bringing in issues of emotion, issues of feelings into thinking. But he is not the only one. I'm also inspired by later day thinkers like Ngugi Thiong'o, for instance, who has been consistent since the 1960s about the necessity of decolonization from a linguistic point of view, from language point of view. And his work, to me, I visited almost all of them, and I gained inspiration from that. And there are many really who who are trailblazers, if I can use that word, in the decolonial. We are not starting from scratch. Thinkers come politicians like Kwame Nkrumah, for instance, whose famous book, Neocolonialism, the last stage of imperialism, published in 1965, is an inspirational book in all this. And then you have thinkers like Claude Ake from Nigeria, who in 1979 published the book Imperialism as Social Science, or Social Science as Imperialism. It is vice versa. Social Science as Imperialism. That book up to today is classic in defining that knowledge can actually be colonized. But I read many thinkers from Africa, from the African diaspora, and from elsewhere, as long as they address the question of, I work very closely with comrades from Latin America, Walter Mignolo, Ramon Crosfocal, Nelson Maldonado Torres. I read the decolonial feminist work by scholars like Maria Legones. I read the African decolonial feminists like Oyeronke Oyewumi, who wrote this award-winning book, The Invention of Women, which is focused on Yoruba in Nigeria. So really, I'm also inspired by the Rhodes Must Fall and the Fees Must Fall, as well as the Black Lives Matter movements in this work which I do.
Thank you so much.